next we are going to further continue about these Incoterms, and as we discuss about X works and the other one FCA. So now as you can see out there onto your screen, there is an entire description about the various Incoterms that are being used in the trade. So these are in toto 11 commonly used Incoterms that are used in international trade. Now when we see about these Incoterms, the two we already discussed upon, that is with respect to X works and free carriage, right. Now the further that we are going to talk about, wherein again the set of responsibility, the obligation, cost and risk that is going to further expand or further going to push towards the shoulder of your seller is from this stage onwards. So herein we talk about that these very specific Incoterms, the 4 Incoterms, wherein these are very specific to one very mode of transportation, that is your sea. So in case of your any shipping, where the carriage is to be conducted through the vessel, it is to be done through the ship. So therein only 4 major Incoterms are there which are very specific to this mode of transportation, which is your FAS, which is FOB, CFR, CIF. So these are very specific to this very mode of transportation. Now starting up with this very specific mode of transportation, which is your shipping, the first very one is FAS, which talks about free alongside ship. Now free alongside ship, it talks about the transfer of risk, that when this risk passes on to the buyer or where it lies onto the shoulder of your seller only. So as we discuss about that, there are lines of activities that are there in this process of conducting an international transaction, wherein right from your packaging to the loading charges to your destination, to the delivery to the very port, and then to paying off the export duties, then to paying off those terminal charges, and then further on unloading and import duties, right. So again we are going to talk about what portion of the obligation is to be taken care by the seller and what portion is to be further taken by the buyer. Now we talk about free alongside ship, यानी कि जब तक शिप पर ऑन बोर्ड नहीं हुआ है, इट इज अलोंगसाइड शिप. सो फ्री अलोंगसाइड शिप का मतलब हुआ कि तब तक जो रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है किसकी है, सेलर की है. एंड द मिनट इट रीचेज अलोंगसाइड शिप, it is not onboarded but alongside ship, it passes on to the buyer. So that is why it is said free alongside ship. So right from your export packaging to your loading charges to making sure that the goods or the consignment reaches to the port area, that is delivery to the port, then paying off the customs duty or the export duties or other cess that are applicable, and then paying off the terminal charges. So all these 5 charges are to be borne by your seller, and thereon further, if any, let's suppose the charges with respect to your loading charges, with respect to your carriage charges, with respect to your insurance, with respect to your further destination to the delivery to the destination, or doing the unloading of the goods and paying of those terminal charges or the import duties, these are to be paid by your buyer. So that means it talks about that until unless it gets onboarded, usse pehle ka sara cost is to be borne by the seller. So that means it is very specific to one mode of transportation, that is your shipping, which talks about ki is shipping ki case mein, because the terminology says free alongside ship. So until unless it is there alongside ship, the entire set of your obligation and risk are there onto the shoulder of your seller. Now again, those general obligation that the seller has to cooperate with respect to their providing the documentation, with respect to providing the delivery of the goods at the agreed price, at the agreed place, on the date and time, right, that is being mentioned in the contract of sale. So that ways you can say about that it's the general obligation of the seller, because it will not be specified into these Incoterms. These are Incoterms which talks about okay, these layers of activities, and herein who will be responsible for what part of activity. But the general obligation will always be standard up, that the seller is supposed to give an intimation, that is a notice to the buyer, that okay, I will be shipping the goods on this and this that date, right, by a this and this vessel, and it will reaches to the port on this and that very date. So that ways the seller is going to give an intimation to the buyer with respect to all these line of activities, right, and the buyer will also provide the due cooperation to the seller with respect to it will receive the consignment, it will pay the price of the consignment to the seller, and it will take the delivery on the set date. It will not refuse, he will not refuse from taking the delivery. So the obligations that are very generic in nature, that will always stand no matter what, that will be there, right. These are additional layers of activities for which we have classified that what proportion of cost and risk is to be transferred and what proportion of the cost and risk is not transferable, right. So herein when we say free alongside ship, so till your this very parameter, when we say that original terminal charges that this is to be paid by your buyer. So right from when the goods get packaged, then to you paying those loading charges, to you making sure that it reaches out to the delivery is done to the port wala area, you pay to those port export charges or any taxes, ancillary taxes, and then you paying of those terminal charges. And the minute those terminal charges are paid, loading is not onto the shoulder of your seller, because it says free alongside, आपने वहाँ तक पहुँचा दिया, टर्मिनल के चार्जेस पे ऑफ कर दिए, यहाँ पर सेलर की ऑब्लिगेशन gets completed. Now it passes on to the buyer. Now the buyer is responsible to engage a vessel or to engage a company which will perform these functions of loading of the cargo, or paying the insurance charges, or paying those cargo charges, or paying those destination terminal charges, and then doing those unloading activities, and then paying for the import duties. So those obligations will be there onto the shoulder of your buyer. The seller is there alongside ship. The minute the goods reaches the alongside ship, you have paid those terminal charges, the seller's obligation gets completed, right. Howsoever, if the seller may cooperate in engaging a carrier for the loading, in providing in the settlement of those insurance coverage, there again if agreed upon, then there is no problem. So they must have agreed about the same on a prior basis. It is not like they would not, they have not agreed upon the same, and the seller is going to incur the expenses and then the buyer will reimburse the cost. No, if the terms and conditions say so, that the seller is only supposed to bear the obligation, cost and risk, and that much part of the cost and risk is to be recovered or claimed from the buyer. So beyond that point, if the seller is going to incur any cost, the buyer will not be held responsible to pay for the same. The seller will not be, you cannot claim for those extra expenses that he has incurred, and he cannot claim the same from the buyer. So that's very crucial to understand, that it doesn't go like that, okay, you keep on spending an extra layer of cost without taking the consent of the buyer on the same, and later on you recover the same from the buyer. That way it will not work, because then you cannot legally claim for those expenses if the buyer has not given the consent for the same, right. So that goes very simply, a very simple logic about the same, that okay, if the buyer agrees upon same and buyer requests the seller that he may engage third party logistics or company or any carriage company, and the seller is supposed to take or undertake all further layers of activities, then maybe they can settle about some different Incoterms wherein there is a broader coverage of the activities with respect to the seller's part and a lesser one with respect to the buyer point, right. So that's what about your free alongside ship, wherein only one mode of transportation, and then to the general obligation, then to the intimation with respect to the goods that being discharged, with respect to the obligation of the buyer to accept the delivery of the goods, no matter whether if the goods are correct, the buyer is supposed to accept the cargo, and the buyer is supposed to accept the cargo on the set date and time as mentioned, as agreed upon. Second thing is the need to mention the place of destination, the point of origin on prior basis in that contract. So they have to specify कि कहाँ से सामान किस point पर जो है reach out करेगा very precisely. They have to mention about the same. This is not what being decided between some local bodies, but it is being decided by the International Chamber of Commerce, and this is the latest version. And one more thing to be added on to the same is that this 2020 version of ICC Incoterms doesn't mean that all those terms which were already there in your 2010 wala, you could say rulings will not be applicable, or they are mandated to use the one only given into or listed out into 2020 version. So it doesn't say like that. You can decide upon, but provided it should have been mentioned onto your contract on a prior basis that both the buyer and the seller has agreed upon these Incoterms on a prior basis, right. Next very Incoterm is your free on board FOB, which is a very commonly used Incoterm. So you would mostly see this FOB whenever you are reading the customs, or whenever you are reading the international trade contracts, you would mostly see that FOB is a very commonly used language and a terminology with respect to the contracts that are being executed for trade. So free on board is means until unless the goods get loaded on, right. So loading तक का जो है आपका charges, it is to be borne, that loading वाला part is to be borne by seller. So free on board means जब बोर्ड पर on board कर दिए goods, अभी तक alongside हैं goods vessel के, अब आप कह रहे हो फ्री ऑन बोर्ड, आपने गुड्स को ऑन बोर्ड कर दिया है, राइट फ्रॉम पैकेजिंग यू हैव परफॉर्म वन एक्टिविटी, then you have made sure that you have paid those make sure ki goods reaches out to the delivery port and port per, and then you paid those export duties, then you paid your further terminal charges, and now you are talking about loading of the cargo, right. So when you are talking about this loading the cargo, then this responsibility lies onto the shoulder of your seller. Further on it passes on to the buyer, but loading का जो है loading on carriage वाला point है, उस point से उस point तक जो responsibility है आपकी seller की है. Further on जो लोडिंग ऑन कैरेज के बाद कार्गो चार्जेस हैं, या फर्दर आपके टर्मिनल चार्ज डेस्टिनेशन के टर्मिनल चार्जेस हैं, या इंपोर्ट ड्यूटीज़ हैं, या अनलोडिंग चार्जेस हैं, अगेन दैट इज़ टू बी प्रोवाइडेड बाय बायर. द सेलर की रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी कहाँ तक है? ऑन बोर्ड दी वेसल. जब तक वेसल के ऊपर आपका जो सामान है, जो कंसाइनमेंट है, इट डजंट reaches on board, the obligation of loading those vessels and taking care of all the damages that come along with any cost, any cost of your damages is to be borne by your seller, and any cost of your you could say losses is to be borne by your seller. Further on आफ्टर दैट अगर लोडिंग करने के बाद कोई भी कार्गो चार्जेस हैं, डिलीवरी डेस्टिनेशन तक का कोई पॉइंट है, या फिर आपका फर्दर इंपोर्ट ड्यूटीज़ हैं, या यू कैन टॉक अबाउट कि आपकी लेट्स सपोज अनलोडिंग चार्जेस है, दैट इज़ टू बी बॉर्न बाय योर बायर. सो फ्री ऑन बोर्ड कब तक? जब तक ऑन बोर्ड नहीं होता. और ऑन बोर्ड होते साथ ही किसकी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है? बायर की रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है, राइट. Now next very Incoterm is cost and freight. So when we say cost and freight, it means अब लोडिंग करने के बाद जो कार्गो चार्जेस है वहाँ तक की रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी किसकी है, सेलर की है। उसके अलावा इंश्योरेंस की नहीं है, इंश्योरेंस इज स्टिल नेगोशिएबल, इंश्योरेंस इज still negotiable unless until, as you can see in this chart, that it is mentioned that it is cost insurance freight, right? So तब तक आपका इंश्योरेंस का पैरामीटर और इंश्योरेंस प्रोवाइड करने का जो ऑब्लिगेशन है, इट इज़ नॉट ऑन टू द शोल्डर ऑफ योर सेलर, it will only be there negotiable as agreed by the parties. So in this case where we are talking about cost and freight, that means you package the goods, you made sure to send the delivery to the this origin port, then you paid those terminal charges, then you paid those export duties, then you paid those loading wala activity you have completed, then you are paying for cargo charges, because this is what it is talking about, cost and freight. So jitna bhi cost and freight hai aapka till after this loading the goods onto the vessel, till that point the obligation is there onto the part of the seller. Further on, the minute insurance enter, the minute the goods reaches to the destination, the minute the goods are delivered at the destination, the destination terminal charges, import duties, unloading charges, everything is to be borne by buyer. So it will only pay for what? Cost freight. Cost freight for which particular mode of transportation? Shipping. So that ways, this is a simplistic view of understanding, okay, what Incoterms suggest, what sort of obligations and cost and risk are there onto the shoulder of your buyer and what are there onto the shoulder of your seller, right? Very clearly it demarcates their responsibility. Again, with respect to general obligations, wherein the obligation to provide the full cooperation to provide the timely delivery at the agreed place and agreed destination ki origin kya hoga, destination hoga, they have to be named one. It cannot just go blankly, it has to be named one now, because now the seller is doing what? The seller is loading the goods on cargo, the seller is paying the cargo charges, right? So that ways it is very, very crucial that the seller should be aware about the named place of destination, and whether your contract of sale should mention about the named and precise place of origin and the place ultimate port of your destination. So ultimate आपका जो place of destination होगा या origin जो port होगा, that has to be very categorically listed down, very precisely being mentioned, the price that's being agreed upon, the settlement terms and conditions that being agreed upon, they have to be categorically mentioned in your contract of sale. So if and again insurance is one such parameter which is in this case again is negotiable, that means both the parties will discuss upon that, okay, whether the onus lies onto the shoulder of your buyer or onto the seller. So they will negotiate about the same. That is why this very Incoterm doesn't talk exclusively about insurance. The next one, which is the cost, insurance and freight, it specifically talks about the exclusive coverage of the insurance, and that too will talk about up to what extent, right? If the coverage is there, but up to what extent it is provided. So that ways you have to be very clear about when mentioning the role of buyer and seller. So because the minute you mention cost freight, so it will be understood that okay, the seller is going to borne the cost till the goods are loaded and the cargo charges for the same are paid, and further on, right from insurance to the end activity, everything is to be taken care by your buyer. So now the cost and risk from the minute the insurance coverage is to be taken care, it is to be taken by your buyer. So that ways it clearly lists out the roles, the responsibilities of both the buyer and the seller. Further on, the intimation with respect to delivery of goods. So the seller is supposed to make the intimation with respect to the the goods that are going to be delivered on which date, because the date again is going to be decided on prior basis, or in case it is not decided on prior basis, the ending point of your contract whichever comes later, so that will serve as a very final end date for providing the consignment to the buyer in case it is not specified. Most of the time, commonly it is already mentioned the place, the date, the time, the quantum, the vessel that is going to carry the shipment. So if it is going by Maersk, it will be mentioned about Maersk that the vessel is going to be this one and the carrier company is going to be that XYZ Limited, and it will reach on that peak port on said date. So that ways it is very it will give sufficient time to both of both the parties to make necessary arrangements with respect to custom clearances, to paying of the duty, to run those quality control, to go for those inspection of the cargo. So that ways they will be having ample time to make the necessary arrangements, and this way in case any of the party breaches from these terms of contract, if let us suppose it mentions about CFR. So CFR means that the seller is supposed to pay for the cargo charges, or the seller is supposed to make sure that the goods are there on board, right? It is automatically said, right? And as we say that it needs not to be explicitly mentioned up. So that ways if the seller fails to complete such point or fails to cooperate in the same or creates a hassle for the buyer is free to revoke that contract, and it will be considered as the breach of contract, and they may can proceed further to the court, and again the arbitration will happen wherever it is being the very jurisdiction that is being specified in the contract. So whatever jurisdiction is mentioned in the contract between the buyer and seller in case of dispute settlement, that will be the appropriate the authority to make a decision in that particular case, because once said any sort of your Incoterms, the seller or the buyer cannot later on step out of the same. So that is why these terms they are used as the language of trade. The last one with respect to the sea or water transportation is your CIF, which talks about cost, insurance and freight. Now herein you can say that it explicitly talks about the insurance parameter, that okay, the seller along with the cargo charges, along with the specific cost is supposed to undertake the obligation for insurance. Now when we specifically talk about insurance in this case, it has to be very clearly understood that insurance to a limited insurance coverage. It is not going to be a comprehensive or a blanket coverage. It is going to be very specific. It is going to be very limited rather. Limited in a sense is the minimum insurance coverage is what the seller is obligated to undertake. That means he has to conduct that contract of insurance wherein the seller is supposed to pay for the cost of insurance and to provide and to bear the loss of insurance, but to the limited clause. So there is a limitation clause which talks about the minimum coverage. However, it says the buyer can request the and can seek that from the seller, that the seller may provide an additional top up services of providing an higher bracket of coverage or higher amount of coverage that should be covered under the insurance parameter, but in that case the buyer will bear the additional charges to the same. The buyer cannot expect onto this very Incoterm that the seller will provide or bear the entire cost of insurance, and it is going to be a blanket coverage or a comprehensive coverage for the cargo. Rather, it is going to be a very limited, very minimum value of insurance coverage as again given under the clause that being specified under the rules, and beyond that the seller is not obligated to provide the coverage. The buyer, if he seeks to he or she seeks that additional coverage should be provided, that can be offered by the seller, but provided the buyer has to bear the cost. the seller will not be bearing the cost of that additional insurance coverage that the buyer seeks for. So that means these terms and conditions are very specific. They list down the sub conditions to the same, they list down the roles, the obligation, the risk parameter and the cost coverage, that what percent or the what segment of the cost is to be borne by the seller and what segment is to be borne by the buyer, and it clearly demarcates the responsibilities, the roles and obligations of both the buyer and seller. Because see, understand, we are dealing in an international transaction where it is not just a simple transaction of a trade, but herein we are also building upon the international relations. We are building key strategic relations with the second nation. So that is why it has to be very strategically taken care of, and so that there is no conflict of interest, there is no breach of contract, because there is also the there is a country name that you are also taking along with. So that means both the buyers and the seller has to be very cautious about of the terms of the Incoterms and the terms and condition additionally mentioned in the contract of sale. So even a contract of sale will mention the nitty-gritties with respect to the material composition of the goods, the sort of ancillary services that are being provided alongside the main category of goods. So for example, the seller would ask for, okay, the goods should be such that it should conform to this IS standard. That means, let's suppose New Zealand when asked for the packaging recently, so it talks about that it should, the packaging should be such that it should be made of wooden, pallets, and that too that it should comply by IS PM 15 standard. That means the fumigation process should have been conducted, the goods should be such that they are free from any infestation from the termites or any beetles. So that means country specific rules are there, and they need to be mentioned and to be read very carefully in a contract of trade when undertaking such international transactions, because otherwise they may have major repercussions on either your buyer or the seller. So either of the party can bear the consequences of the same, and that is why it is very clearly said that all these Incoterms to be very carefully read, to be understood when putting them up in a contract of sale, and to understand, okay, that what additionally if you need to add on to something, so then an additional note or to with respect to the same should be mentioned out in the contract of sale. And also the conformity with respect to different IS standards or with respect to different packaging labeling rules, they will also be mentioned out in the contract of sale. The price will also be mentioned out in the contract of sale along with these Incoterms, because these are 11 commonly used Incoterms that specifies, okay, that the obligation and cost of what portion is to be borne by the buyer and what portion is to be taken by the seller. So that means it just talks about those parameters, but beyond that there are also some general obligations on both the on the part of both the parties, wherein it is with respect to documentation that the contract should specify that what list of documents are to be provided by the seller at what point, right, and what documents are to be provided by the importer and which stage and by what date even. So that means they very categorically, the contract of sale very categorically it talks about the details, it talks about the date, it talks about the price, it talks about the quantum and the place, the very destination, the location, and that too very named one and a precise one. So it goes very detailed, the contract are very detailed, it specifies each and every term and condition, and even as I mentioned that the material composition that is to be considered along with. Otherwise it can be very contentious with respect to, okay, these very XYZ details are not mentioned. So that may lead to again the tussle between the importer and exporter, and ultimately it is going to impact the international relations also, since we are representing our nation on the global standard. So we will be talking about some more Incoterms like your CPT, CIP, TAP, DPU, DDP, which talks again about the different the obligations that being additional layer of obligations that is to be covered by the seller and the buyer, and will be for any queries you can just drop down your queries onto the comment box. And till then, thank you, have a good day.